So this talk will present a range of recent design projects which aim to operate as a recourse to certain practical and philosophical legacies of modernity that are still prevalent in the discipline today. Legacies which include a desire for dominance over nature, a celebration of technological progress, and an aspiration to deny historical and environmental contexts. Attitudes that are all exacerbating the ongoing damage to our environment through the use of fossil fuels. Instead, the work seeks to offer an alternative approach by investigating how architecture can operate in a performative and poetic manner. It will do this, firstly, by questioning political actions that seek to deny the presence of the effects of climate change and seek to promote the ongoing belief that as an advanced technological society, we will be able to negate the effects of climate change through our scientific and technological prowess. This is focused on the way the government and environmental agencies in the country plan to defend against flooding in the Thames estuary through the construction of further flood defences and a huge new large mechanical barrier at Tilbury. Actions which require vast amounts of resources and energy to construct. Actions that further exacerbate the effects of climate change. Secondly, to emphasise the fragility of the environment and our standing within it, questioning the increasing use of technocratic processes that aim to inform design, such as an emphasis on material performance and the instigation of heavy regulatory requirements. Requirements that seek to ensure the focus of design decisions is based on the efficiency of a building's ability to mitigate and control climate around strict parameters of what is determined to be comfortable and efficient. Further, in the name of efficiency, we are also increasingly seeing buildings becoming designed as automated entities with heating and cooling systems controlled by centralized and sometimes even remote computer systems. Within these environments, we have become generalized and inactive bodies, cut off and desensitized from a direct relationship with the outside environment. It is a condition which means increasingly we no longer have control or individual agency in mediating these interior spaces with the exterior world. In this capacity, the work has been informed by the thoughts of historian Alberto Pérez Gómez, who argues against architecture's insistence on functionist logics, including those manifesting an emphasis on technological reasoning, which for Gómez have prevented the discipline from exploring conditions of the poetic, limiting its ability to engage with and create a meaningful experience of the world. In the book, Architecture and the Crisis of Modern Science, Gómez argues, because positivist thought has made it a point to exclude mystery and poetry, contemporary man lives with the illusion of the infinite power of reason. He has forgotten his fragility and his capacity for wonder, generally assuming that all the phenomena of his world have been explained. Lastly, the work seeks to suggest ways we might think and act more slowly to enable greater criticality towards practices that seek to promote propagations of modernity that are driven by capital and commerce, a condition that could be seen in the discourse around certain architectures that prioritize narratives of progress in their use of computational design tools. To enable this inquiry, the work has also been informed by two distinct cultural reference points. The first of these is the innovative cross-disciplinary practices that operated between art, architecture, and performance that were conducted primarily in the 1960s and 70s. These practices are important as they sought to prioritize the experience of the body through performative and poetic acts that included structures that moved or altered their form due to the effects of material processes or the weather. These events and structures also sought to highlight the processes that make up the natural world and draw attention to the damage being done to it at that time. This cross-disciplinary work also resonates with performance theorists Rita Hanna and Haslav Olaf in their assessment that design artifacts, whether objects, materials, occasions, environments, or still and moving images, are inextricably bound to performance through notions of embodiment, action, and event. Key influences include the work of artist Gianni Patana, an architect who emerged for the Florentine radical movement in the 1960s and 70s. The work of architect and poet Ray Abraham, and in particular his 10 Houses projects from 1970-73. Particularly in 10 Houses, Abraham presents us with a series of poetic and drawn explorations of architecture existing in a non-specific landscape. These designs contain a series of motifs, including specific materials, burial mounds, and formal components that mimic natural forms. The work also exists as a theoretical exploration that seeks to link the physical actions of drawing to architecture's physical interference with any site when eventually built. Also of importance is artist Robert Morris, who, according to art historian Max Kozloff, embodied the poetics of softness in his work through an emphasis on the way the work manifested and recorded natural conditions such as gravity, the process by which it was made, or the presence of the human body. And finally, architect and writer Bernard Tschumi, who sought to promote the idea of architecture as formed from events and actions. The second cultural context that the work relates directly to are notions of reenactment that look to use and reuse historical sources placed in contemporary contexts. Performance theorist Rebecca Schneider understands reenactment as a mechanism that troubles linear temporality by offering at least the suggestion of recurrence or return, even if the practice is peppered with its ongoing incompletion. This sentiment is echoed by Catherine Wood, curator of performance and contemporary art at Tate Modern, who describes this process as a means of treating art history not as a fixed set of facts with an inevitable outcome in the present, but rather an open space of conflict being continually reenacted. These ideas can be seen in the work of artists such as Goshen Makuga and Pablo Bronstein, where Bronstein's reenactment and role plays historical figures or styles when he draws. And Makuga looks to recontextualize historic works such as Malevich's Architectons into new contexts. In the case of this work, she gives the structures a scale and a function, conditions which Malevich originally ignored. So the first set of work I'm going to talk about, as suggested in the introduction, looks at the threat primarily from flooding, and also acts as a way to look at other forms of inhabitation of a flood-prone environment that don't require the instigation of massive technological interventions, such as what is proposed at Tilbury. So the Thames Estuary is probably one of the places that in this country that is right on the front line of the threat from climate change, and is already suffering interventions, if you like, and interventions and problems that are caused by rise in sea level. So the site that I'm particularly interested in is a place called Cliff, which is on the Kent coast of the estuary in the mouth of the Thames, and the site has historically been a kind of salt marsh, and has historically always been protected from the sea with massive flood walls and flood barriers, and this is what it looks like at the moment. So the first kind of act that I proposed within this project was to look at the idea of reflooding that landscape and turning it back into a tidal marsh. So this drawing was the first act, if you like, within the move of the project, and what it set to represent is the idea of what that landscape would look like. And at the moment, this kind of dotted line that you see here, I'm not sure you can see my arrow, but the dotted line on the south coast, if you like, is where the sea wall was, and if it was removed, this is what would happen to the river. It would kind of splay into the land. This is something that's already being looked at as a kind of potential extension of flood defence, where you allow water to flood into the landscape using the natural flora and fauna as a flood defence, and also storing flood water to stop it affecting areas of land upstream. And this is Abbot Hall in Essex, where they're looking at this type of flood defence. Series of drawings which show the movement, potential movements of the river at different conditions of high and low tide, and also of different conditions of flooding. And then this is the first structure that I thought to propose within this kind of landscape. And this is a kind of small structure, a small dwelling made of reed and sediment, and would be a place to kind of rest, if you like, within that landscape. On a more infrastructural scale, I was looking at the idea of proposing a series of beaches that would be formed by slowing the sediment with the use of sediment nets. And sediment nets are used kind of globally, where they're inserted into floodplains and stop the water, the flow of the water, the speed of the water, allowing sediment to fall, and then you essentially create kind of beaches from that process. And these would be ways to access the landscape and move across that landscape. I was also looking at the idea of houses that might be might float, or even in this case that might be blown if the surface of the water of the landscape when flooded would freeze, and then you could essentially attach sails to a house that then it could be blown across the landscape. So the filter house actually came a few years after those initial designs, and it was a return that I decided to do back into this project because I felt it was kind of unfinished. And one of the things that I felt was unfinished about it was really to start to think about what life might be like within this environment, to imagine, you know, how you could kind of operate day to day within a landscape that was under the threat of constant flooding. And one of the things I thought about and realized and researched that one of the problems of this landscape or returning to the flood is that you cut off people who live there from the electricity grid, but also their access to fresh water. So this project was a means to deal primarily with the idea of how you might get access to fresh water. It's called the Filter House, and it proposes a salt distillation facility and also a house. So if you'll see in the chamber on the left-hand side of the drawing, in the kind of bell jar space, would essentially take in water at high tide and then would heat it, turn it into steam, cool it, and collect it for drinking water. There's also a chamber in the center of that bell jar where you could essentially go and visit, and you would experience that process of distillation. So drawing of it in the landscape, kind of model photo drawing of inside the filter house, and then the filter house when that steaming process would occur, changing the nature of the environment inside. What I was also interested in exploring with this project was how the house might reflect a psychological state of those who would be experiencing that flooding event, and particularly the anxiety that might be caused through the experience of the water rising and never knowing if it would recede again. So these are drawings that I did that would try to illustrate what it might be like to be in the center of the steam chamber while it was in the process of distillation. And the idea is on the left that you're in there where it's clear, you can see views across the landscape. And then on the right, when the steam occurs, you lose connection back with the landscape, and that you're kind of enclosed within this chamber, reflective of a kind of claustrophobia or fear that might occur in relationship to the events that are occurring outside. Also, that in the houses there are certain kind of allusions, if you like, to psychoanalytic imagery, and particularly here is the reference to the mirror, because if the house is a state of mind, then how do you manifest that within an architecture? And the presence of the mirror in psychoanalytic theory is very prevalent, and here it exists not in a physical actualization of a mirror, but the idea that you might be in one part of the building looking back through to the other part of the building that looks exactly the same as where you are, but it isn't, because that chamber doesn't fill up with steam. Also within these drawings was the idea that you would represent steam as a kind of fundamental material of the building. And here is a kind of close-up of you know, a moment in time of an elevation of the distillation chamber. What's also important about these drawings is that they were an attempt to act as an analogy to the idea of the building being a kind of constant state of change, and therefore the drawings in a kind of constant state of change. So to kind of achieve that, I processed the images through photocopying them and photocopying them and photocopying them. And the purpose of that was to suggest that the drawing was unstable, that there wasn't ever any particular point within the process of the photocopying that might actualize or definitively illustrate the building at any point. It's in a kind of constant state of change. Kind of slightly after I'd completed the filter house, I kind of revisited it within the context of the ideas of reenactment I've been looking at. And you know, clearly the work in my mind had developed out a series of references, and that I wanted to embody that somehow within the way the project was represented. I also wanted it to these drawings to highlight the fact that they were knowing of the kind of fiction in the work, that the construction of the work as a you know, purely narrative or drawn project. And with this drawing, I decided to draw it as though it were a part of the Manhattan transcripts by Bernard Tschumi. So Bernard Tschumi did, for people who know, Bernard Tschumi, this project in the early 70s, where he proposed partly the idea that architectures would be formed through the movements of bodies through space, that they become vectors constructing walls. And in the drawing of the filter house, I was trying to illustrate, I suppose, the performative elements of the building. So on the left is, I think it's your left, my left, your right, is the constant movement that would occur of a body moving back and forth between the two chambers. The middle drawing is the steam chamber, which the steam rises and falls, and then the black square is representative of the sea rising and falling. So in Tschumy's Manhattan transcripts, the actions become solidified, and then in the drawing of the filter house, the performative actions become solidified and represented. So the next project, again, came slightly later, was another, I think I abandoned this body of work and then returned to it 3 or 4 years later with this project, which is the Silt House. And the Silt House, again, is a dwelling which occupies the landscape at Cliff, but it doesn't have a separate function as the filter house does. It is a house for several people to live at once. There isn't really any distinction of rooms. You can kind of wander the house, sleep where you want, eat where you want. Within the house itself, you can kind of live a relatively nomadic condition as long as you're in it and not in the landscape. So this is this is an exploded axonometric, where you see that it's kind of belly pulled apart, which you see in this drawing, and you can see the interior landscape of where you might sleep or eat. This is it on the sediment bed, an overhead plan perspective of the drawing. And then also alongside the main house, I was looking at the idea of a refuge that you might go to escape the house, but also the flood. And this kind of manifests as this drawing. So it's one of 2 buildings. So like the filter house, I was also interested in what essentially might be a kind of solid, stable piece of building embedded into the mudflat might also build a reciprocity with the landscape, like the filter house did. And what I was interested in with the Silt House is exploring 2 methods where the building uses the flood in some way to allow living in the building to be easier. So the first of these is the idea that you would have a series of sediment nets that would encircle the structure. And during the winter, when the flood season would occur, you would allow sediment to fall on top of the structure, creating a greater thermal mass. So those inside the building would feel greater warmth while the building was kind of buried in the sediment. And I actually constructed a kind of simulation of what this process might look like over time using RealFlow. So this is a plan of the building that was put into an animation where different weights of particle were projected within a fluid to kind of show the build-up of sediment and the effect that the structure would have within such an environment. And actually what's quite interesting about this drawing for me was I did it after I designed the structure, but actually the forms that are somehow created through the modulations in the sediment and the water were kind of very similar to the form and language of the Silt House and also its interior. The second operation is the idea that the Silt House could take in water at high tide. This water would be used to flush out any collection of sewage that had collected and rubbish that had collected in the house by those who were living in it, and then it would be flushed out of a small hole or ejected from a small hole in the back of the building. So in both cases, if we look at the filter house embodying a kind of state of mind, the silt house performed a state of mind through its burial and also its defecation when the flood occurs. So it acts in part like a body, and that these operations would occur because of the changes in the landscape and the fear of the flood. Again, like the filter house, I was interested in drawing it in a way that showed its transience, if you like, that it's part of a system and that it's in a kind of state of decay or change. And in this case, just drawing the shadow to kind of highlight that the effects of the environment are important, as critical to the manifestation of the structure as the actual physical thing itself. Also, I was using in the development of the design a process of direct reciprocity with history, and particularly using Abraham's 10 Houses designs to develop a kind of grammar, if you like. I was particularly interested in the nature of the way that Abraham's 10 Houses projects had embodied a kind of poetry in relationship to the landscape, and wanted that to somehow be reflected. And therefore it was quite a conscious decision to try to use tropes that Abraham was using and meld those into the design of the silt house. So you can see the cloud house on the by Abraham on your right or left, so I'm not sure, and then which the kind of concrete, kind of gaseous forms of the cloud are kind of formed into this environment below the house. And then in the silt house, you can see potentially the nature of the mud flat that would be seen outside the house, manifestation in these kind of weird forms of the internal landscape. Also, burial mounds and primitive structures were very present in Abraham's work, and then that folds over into the silt house through its burial in the sediment. I also drew it similar to the filter house, as though it were part of the Manhattan transcripts, to highlight the way that the house would control the movements of the body. And the idea being that although it was static in it was a static, fixed, solid object, the house, your movements through it would almost be akin to be moving on the mudflat itself outside, that you would be projected up and down and over these surfaces. So the last kind of house, drawn house in this series is the Bang Bang house. And this is actually sited on the opposite side of the river, just by Canby Island. And again, one of the critical elements to it was the idea of it performing, this performance being read as a kind of poetic, if you like, but also that it was manifesting potentially a fear of the flood in those that lived inside it. And the way that it did this is that it was a floating structure, unlike the other ones which were fixed, but it was set within a kind of pen, if you like. So this is an exploded isometric of that building, showing the interior and the roof, and actually it's quite a simple structure, kind of pitch roof, industrial structure set within this piled pen. So when the floodwater rises, the structure would float, but it can't float off. It has to kind of move around and particularly bang against the steel piles which are keeping it in its place. And for anyone who's been on a large boat, I suppose, or of a structure like that, that banging of one piece of metal against another is quite unnerving. And I think that it would be, the idea is that it would again be representative of the fear that the flood might never fall back, and that you would be left in this kind of constant flooded environment. There are rooms in the Bang Bang house you can see where you can go and potentially escape the sound of the banging, but the idea is that really there would only be quiet once the tide water receded, and it would sit back down onto the mudflat. So these projects I've kind of been working for, as I said, for quite a few years, and in 2016 I was very lucky enough to receive a substantial bit of funding to potentially construct one of these architectures, or certainly a version of them within the estuary. So the funding came partly through UCL at the time, but also through Focal Point Gallery in Southend, and a bit from other sources, kind of pulled together. So the project was a collaboration between myself, Focal Point, UCL, but also curator Jez Fernie, who is a kind of well-renowned commissioner of public art, and she helped me work on the public programs for the project. So one of the key aims of the project was to, as with the other projects, to present this kind of poetic performative dwelling in the landscape, but also highlight to those witnessing it the threat that is posed by flooding in that region, but also to highlight the way that the landscape has been changed and defined by the flooding condition. So it's really an area that experienced the last great flood that we've seen in this country in 1953, where essentially the whole areas of that landscape were completely wiped out. And this is kind of pictures of Canby Island. But also what happened to that landscape then is it became incredibly fortified, and anyone who's been there will see that the sea walls loom over the whole of the town, or the built environment in that place, particularly Canby Island. So initially the idea was to have a structure piled to the mudflat. And actually we went quite far with this proposal, working with Arup engineers, but actually after a huge amount of kind of research and development of it, it became clear that it was almost impossible to logistically do this within the budgets that we had. But I still think it's kind of interesting proposal. One of the things we were also hoping to do with this version of the structure was to test certain concretes and how they behave, or how they would behave in a kind of constantly tidal condition. So after a kind of soul searching of essentially coming up against a wall again at that proposal, I returned to one of the very early versions or architectures that I had proposed, and in this case the blown house, and became interested in a house that would move through that landscape, which is very different, if you like, to all the other architectures that had been designed. So the idea developed in collaboration with Jez and Focal Point was to have a structure that would be initially moored in Canby Island, would move to Wakering, and then finally to Southend Pier, where it would be moored for 2 weeks, and the whole project would last about 6 weeks. Meanwhile, we would also commission a series of artworks that would sit along the flood house and discuss kind of themes of landscape and environment that the flood house was engaging with. So one of the things that I was hoping to, as I said, raise was how that landscape is defined by water and flood defence. And one of the kind of most prevalent ways that exists is the kind of way that the land is merged together, but actually consists of a series of islands that are attached or not attached through waterways, and that these islands are allowed to exist through the fortification of flood defence. So the idea is the flood house would travel around these bits of landscape, kind of highlighting and showing these different waterways that exist there. The language of the structure was developed in relationship to what I kind of termed the estuary vernaculars, which included kind of the concrete barges or abandoned concrete barges, the pillboxes that were left over from the war, Montfort sea forts, which I think are very famous, and the kind of marine architectures of piers and huts and fishing huts. Also quite critical was this find, which is an old abandoned steamer, I think in Wakering, which sits on an old abandoned concrete pier. I was kind of fascinated by this, the kind of relic of something which is of the land, or as well of the sea, but is now becoming of the land. And that was quite important to the way that the flood house looked, that it wasn't a boat and it wasn't a house, it was something in between. So this is the kind of final design of the project. It sat on Unifloat, link float pontoons, which are kind of military grade marine kit. I also did design an interior to the flood house, which was never constructed, partly because the Port of London Authority didn't want people to be inhabiting the structure, which is, you know, the permissions needed to action the project were quite difficult. But the way that we used the interior was actually in one of the commissions by a writer called Joanna Quinn, who wrote a story, short science fiction story of what inhabiting the flood house might have been like in a kind of future flood environment where the sea wall no longer defines a clear distinction between land and sea. And this is where this interior kind of took on a role. Kind of more drawings. And then this is a final render just before it was constructed for publicity. And then this was the structure in the landscape. One of the things that Focal Point were also keen for me to action, and I think also to provide some sort of bridge in terms of people understanding the project, because although we called it a house, it wasn't functioning as a house, and although it was a public art piece, and there was a kind of conversation about how the general public, in terms of Focal Point's eyes, might engage with that idea. And I think it was kind of interesting proposal, you know, to call something a house, but it's not a house. So one of the ways that we thought of dealing with that was actually to give it another function, and in this case we put a localized weather station on the structure, which beamed specific information to the website at different times. And as it moved around, it gave very different conditions of the weather. Also, on the you'll see on the weather vane that sits on the structure was another commission by an artist called Ruth Ewan. Very, very interesting artist. And she produced the weather vane work and titled it All Distinctions Leveled. And the reference to level had two specific functions. The first of this was a reference to a 14th century itinerant priest called John Ball, who had given a famous sermon in 1381 as part of a peasant revolt in Essex, looking at trying to dismantle the injustice of the English tax system at the time. And part of the sermon reads, "My good friends, things cannot go on well in England, nor ever will until everything shall be in common, when there shall be neither vassal nor lord, and all distinctions levelled." And what I think interested Ruth about that proposal stemmed from conversations that we had had about the purpose of the structure. And one of the things she latched onto in terms of the research I'd done was the idea that the flood defences were being kept all along the Thames, primarily because they were protecting land for development. And that if that land was lost, then a vast resource in terms of the development of capital would occur. So for Ruth, I think that the reference to John Ball and the idea of levelling an economic condition with that of levelling the distinction between land and sea were intrinsically linked within that part of the landscape. This is a photo of it at Wakering, as was the last photo. I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier that was critical for me was the way that the structure, although novel, if you saw it several times, it kind of remained the same. But the thing that changed was the landscape and the different landscapes that it encountered. So here at Wakering was this kind of bucolic mudflat, but as you'll see in later photos in Southend, it was a kind of urban condition. So this structure moving around the landscape was a means not only to talk about it as a thing, but also then to reflect on a reading of the landscape in those that saw it. It's a photo of the team, the marine logistics team that helped me pull it round, Hart Marine. And here they're digging the temporary mooring for the structure at Southend Pier. I was quite interested in the perversity of the fact that you had to dig into the ground to develop this immaterial architecture. It felt, well, not immaterial architecture, but architecture that supposedly had a kind of fluidity, or meant to have a fluidity to it. As it being tugged around, this is in the North Sea, was a kind of photo that was sent to me at 3 in the morning, no, 5 in the morning by the tug captain telling me that everything was okay. And then this is it at Southend Pier, where it's at for 2 weeks. This is actually probably my favourite piece of work that emerged from the project. And it was a drawing that was done by Rob Hart, who was in charge of moving the structure, and it was his navigational map, and he gave it to me at the end of the project, showing me the route that the structure has taken, and it moving away from Canvey Island, going around into the North Sea, down into the River Croach, into Wakering, and back again. What was also interesting is that actually it was coming back for the launch of the kind of opening, if you like, that we did on Southend Pier with Focal Point. A storm hit, and he had to take the structure over into the Medway on the other side of the estuary and stay low until eventually crossing it the morning of when the opening was meant to happen. And what I was quite interested in this drawing is that for me it feels that this is an extension of the house, a kind of plan, if you like, that's describing the territory of the house's occupation being the architecture as much as the physical structure itself. And actually what made me think about that map in that way was a project by Patana called Redline Siege, where himself and his students drove a pickup truck around the municipal border of Salt Lake City, where Patana was teaching, to demark the municipal boundary. And Patana has talked about the idea of the line being a critique of the way that we try to define what is urban and what is rural. And I kind of saw in that ambition the idea of the flood house moving around the seawall, trying to highlight how essentially we can define arbitrarily, if you like, or almost arbitrarily, what is condition of land and what is condition of flood. The removal of that seawall and that distinction would be removed. And Patana also, within the Redline Siege, talks about how the fact that the distinction was, removed once you started to see the line and you saw that the urban existed in the rural and the rural existed in the urban. And then this is kind of one of my favourite photos of the flood house, where you look at it from Southend through Adventureland to its position out onto the mudflat. So this is the last project, if you like, in I suppose the drawn series looking at architecture and the environment, and this is the Measure House. So I moved away slightly from flooding. I wanted to explore some of these ideas in a different context that I've been working with these structures, but looking instead of flooding, looking at temperature rise. And the site, if you like, for this inquiry for me was the Gulf Stream, which kind of moves through the Atlantic and cools and heats different countries across the Atlantic as it moves northwards to the polar ice, to Greenland and the North Pole. And due to climate change, no one really knows what's going to happen to the Gulf Stream. No one knows if it's going to collapse or if it's going to speed up or increase. Certainly the ice falling from the North Pole into the Gulf Stream is slowing it or is changing its trajectories. And what I was particularly interested in is the way that this kind of massive ecosystem affects very specific locations within England, and particularly the west coast of England, that because of the Gulf Stream receives much higher average temperatures than the rest of the country. And the distortion of the Gulf Stream would dramatically change these environments. The site that I chose was a place called Dean Quarry on the peninsula in Cornwall. It's a now defunct quarry, if you like. Within choosing the site, I was quite interested in environmental modelling. It kind of fascinates me in some way, but I wanted to find the most exposed site that would experience the most extreme conditions of the environmental conditions that exist there. So the most extreme wind, the most extreme heat, the most extreme cool. And I mean, I didn't need the modelling to tell me that, but basically that was the site that was the most exposed. So this is a site plan of the proposal in the quarry. The building sits in the middle of the drawing. And then this is a drawing of the project, which exists as a kind of skeletal grid structure that has a series of smaller dwellings that sit within, within this grid. The drawing showing that. So these different houses, if you like, that sit within the grid all have different ways of controlling temperature, and they're very basic ways. There is no mechanical cooling or heating programmed within the structure. So at the top of the design, the main house is the bunker room, which has 2 meter thick concrete walls where the temperature pretty much will stay consistent depending on the either whether it's hot or cold outside. Then you have the felt room, which you could probably see in elevation, is more like a tent structure, and then you have these series of staircases and platforms which take you between each of the structures. And the idea is really that depending on the change in the weather, whether that's something we're more familiar to in terms of the shift from summer and winter, or something that would be distorted, that you would physically have to move yourself between the different rooms to develop a sense of comfort. Whether you needed to feel cool, you might go to the bunker room, or if the bunker room is too cool and you want to experience a more temperate temperature, you might need to go to the felt room. Also, the idea was that like temperature, the movements of celestial patterns, similar into the flood projects, if you like, the movement celestial patterns that are kind of manifest in the movements of the tide, the movement of the sun traveling through the structure would add an element to the architecture. That particularly if the temperature becomes warmer and there's less cloud, these shadows become more prevalent within the way the structure was read. These are kind of drawings showing the different temperate climates, different parts of the house, different parts of the times of the year. Yeah. So moving on to the last project I'm going to briefly talk about. I hope I'm okay for time. And this is, I suppose, a kind of deviation, if you like, and a focusing of some of the developments that the other projects were embodying, specifically the relationship with historical architectures. And I wanted to just distill that slightly into a single kind of statement, separate from an architecture which was really engaging with specific environmental conditions. I wanted to explore, particularly because I wanted to explore in more depth the meaning of why you might want to look at architectures from a particular period and recite them in a contemporary context. And partly that was to do with to learn, but within this case, I was interested also in the provocation of citing historical references as critical, as a kind of standpoint against narratives of progress, which we see, I suppose, in architectures which emphasize technology and efficiency. And it's something that I suppose can be attributed, to a kind of to a postmodernism. But I wanted to explore that slightly further within current developments of design. And it was also something that was, I suppose, critical to the editing of the issue of AD that I did with Luke Pearson, where we were specifically looking at contemporary architects who were using architecture in the 60s and 70s. And trying to find out why that was happening. There were people like Jimenez Lai included in the issue, and Andrew Kovacs kind of working in the States. Also people like Perry Culper, whose work has a kind of resonance back to this period, and trying to explore what the purpose of this referencing was. Just to kind of quickly say, the drawing on the cover was something that Luke and I did very quickly, quite whimsically, if you like, where we placed all of our projects within the grid, or the drawn grid of a ArchiZoom project. If anyone knows the Non-Stop City project by ArchiZoom, it uses this kind of point grid. ArchiZoom being one of the key protagonists in the 1960s and 70s and of the avant-garde of that period. But within my own project that I submitted to this to the journal, I wanted to be more critical or more expansive with the notion of what a reference could be. So within the use of Abraham, if you like, within the Stilt House, that was much more of a deliberate forensic adaptation of one time into another. And I was just slightly wary that was becoming too prevalent across discourse, and wanted to know how I might add to that or question it. And the way that I did that was to take a famous Superstudio drawing, who were another key proponents of the avant-garde of the 60s and 70s, in this case a design for furniture that they proposed, and to drag that across the surface of a photocopier, essentially defacing it and constructing these other landscapes. So this was kind of this is where I kind of produced a kind of wave-like motion, if you like, across the surface of the scanner. I think what's also important with these drawings is that they were the manifestation of a physical act, and the physical act of me moving, with my body, something that was then recorded, that movement. It's kind of encapsulating an action in time, and that action in time was the distortion of a historic architecture. After those were produced, I then started to kind of cut out forms that I could read as architectural elements or architectonic. And I've kind of likened this, I suppose that the closest you can see to this is kind of sampling in music, where you might take a sample from a drum beat or a note, and then you can distort it, in terms of stretching it, condensing it. But always what's left, as far as I know, people who develop music, friends of mine, is that however much you change the original sample, you always have that essence of it left. It's always still present in the final piece of music, that you don't lose the quality of the original. And that was something that was very important. That although these were distortions of Superstudio, their presence was still there. And actually, I've tried it with my own grids, this process, and actually it doesn't give you the same kind of quality that this drawing does. So then I turned it on an axonometric, and then developed it into a proposal. And although it's obviously quite speculative, it's the design of a chamber that sits below the street in Florence, and becomes a refuge to Superstudio. Sorry, there's sounds of my children in the background. I don't know if you can hear. So this I called a monument to Superstudio, a place that you would go below in Florence, and you would kind of escape the intensity of the city and kind of ponder Superstudio in some capacity, and their genius, if you like, through this distortion. These are kind of earlier versions of the design. The one that was finally published was this. Another distortion that I did of the drawing was I photocopied it and photocopied it and photocopied it until I essentially erased it. We were left with these kind of remnants or dots of the original drawing. And then out of this distortion, I proposed the idea that you would have a series of holes that were drilled in the surface of Florence that would allow water to travel through the concrete, creating these kind of stalagmites and stalactites on the underside, on the soffit of the chamber, the Superstudio chamber. And then also you would have in the floor of the undulating surface tubes that would blow very subtle amounts of air, and they were all positioned, if you like, in relationship to the dots or the points that were then captured from that distortion of the Superstudio grid. And what I was quite interested in this proposal as different to the use of the Abraham reference is the idea that I am both being reverential to Superstudio, but also I'm enacting a kind of form of iconoclasm, in the sense that I'm destroying that original image to construct something else. And I was quite what's very important to that was that it acknowledges a history, acknowledges the fact that you are returning to a point in time, that you're not necessarily always emphasizing a progress, yet you're not static with that point in time, that you are adapting it to develop this new architecture. And ultimately, the constellations of what you can produce are infinite, depending on the amount of times that you might rephotocopy or distort that architecture. And that's the end.
Matthew, fantastic. Thank you. Perhaps if you unshare your screen,
yeah,
I can see you again. If you have questions or comments for Matthew, then would you just identify yourself in the chat box, please? Preferably not before 6:29.
Sorry about my children in the background. I think there's an overheating of.
It sounded quite dramatic.
Added to the siren. Sorry.
I mean, I was intrigued. You described these as, I think, performative structures, and I wondered about. For people who know your biography, you're the son of a distinguished choreographer. I mean, you talked about someone like Pablo Bronstein, who's someone who both makes speculative architectural projects, but also works in the field of performance. I wondered, for you, it feels that that actually getting into the territory of choreography or performance per se lies a bit outside your practice. I wondered how you're not interested in you're interested in creating environments in which determine how people might interact with spaces, but you're not actually choreographing movement in the way that a dance choreographer might. Could you talk a little about how you define the edges, the perimeter of your practice in that way?
It's really, and this is part of I think further historical analysis that I have written about in various articles. But that period in the 1960s and 70s really was, in many ways, an exchange between these disciplines. That performance art, architecture, and art were kind of learning from each other within these particular practitioners, and that goes with Robert Morris. It goes with Gianni Pitana particularly. Where they were moving from the scale of actions of the body to drawings, but also then resonating with these actions in structures and architectures. And I think that for me, actually studying that, realizing that you can describe an architecture as a performance and as performative, but it is in the kind of loosest notions of those terms. I mean, it's very disputed territory, but certainly I'm willing to allow an architecture to be seen as performative because it is performance-like. And I think choreographing the movement of something around the coast of a landscape is a kind of choreography of performance. And Gianni Pitana in his built structures, things like Ice House, where he submerged a building in ice in Minneapolis, I think. He talks about the choreography of that, and he talks about it developing a script for it. So his drawings become a kind of script. So I think it is contested. I think it's you will get performance theorists that will dispute any idea of performance existing out something being on a stage or a performer on a stage. But I think it's useful for us to think about these things because it actually opens up possibilities for critique and possibilities to reevaluate what we do in certain realms and spheres, and also kind of cross-culturally.
And I mean, I was struck that the last project, I think, was the first one you showed in an urban context, where one begins imagining a kind of inhabitation of that place, where perhaps there are enough people to constitute a performers and an audience, as it were. I mean, is that a significant development for you in the practice? Do you think that do you see that as a kind of, is that going to be a recurring preoccupation, working in situations that are less isolated?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I think it's something that would be interesting to develop. I mean, I think that with the Flood House, actually, and I didn't show any of these slides, but there were a whole series of performances that existed actually on the pier during the launch of the structure, where there was you know, John Ball was the reference. There was singers that Ruth Ewan and the gallery commissioned to sing his sermon while we were watching the structure. I mean, I'm still interested in the idea I am interested in people's movements of bodies through space, but I am also fascinated by the idea that you can call an architecture a performance in some capacity, because you're challenging certain precepts of what we imagine architecture to be. And this is something Dorita Hanna actually talks about, is kind of performance theorist, and she talks about the idea that by using terminologies of performance against architecture, you start to undermine the idea of it being this kind of having this rigidity and this kind of stable quality that we expect buildings to have, that there is a sense that you undermine that. And then by undermining that, you then start to open up other possibilities for the way that we read buildings and see them in the landscape and see them in the environment.
It's very interesting. We have a question from Perry Dean Culper. I'm asking to unmute. Perry, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Matthew. That is really, really nice.
Hi, Perry.
Funnily enough, hi. I think it's the first time I've ever heard you talk about the work, so it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. You know, it's a simple question, maybe with current contemporary ramifications. Your interest in all kinds of dynamics, weather, temperature, atmosphere, water. I wondered if there's a corollary in your work to come, which has to do with things like social media, in which I'm sitting here strapped to Zoom, not moving ever, but somehow there are atmospheres constructed around me that are coming to me. And I wonder if there would be, I just like thinking about your work and how there might be a contemporary condition of stasis and data and information which are not felt in a kind of perceptual, in an embodied way, let's say, but are part of our contemporary culture of isolation. And I'll work on that one if you don't.
Yeah, no, I think I'm trying to think about how I would incorporate that, but actually I think that to a certain extent it existed in the Flood House anyway, that we would, and the way that project really was experienced was through certain events that occurred almost virtually, that we were posting photos of it as it moved around the landscape. We were posting things online. We had this kind of constant feed from the measurement of temperature and climate that it was prevailing. And I mean, apart from the event at the Southend Pier, where there was a few hundred people that came down to see it, actually I don't know if people engaged with that project beyond the photos of it and the data that it was projecting. And I think there's a history of that within in performance art anyway, I mean, as well, you know, the sense of, and also with land artists, you know, the sense that the work existed in its record as much as it did in its physical form. And so I wonder if it's an extension of that already exists.
Seems close,
but I don't know if I'm quite interested in the idea that you might disrupt patterns of data feed in some capacity. I don't know, it's interesting, Perry.
Seems like you could get
Sounds like something.
No, you. Anyway, thank you very much. Also to the Architecture Foundation, this is fantastic.